It was supposed to be a harmless prank, one of those stupid jokes that young men play to pass the time and make each other laugh. But this one went too far, way too far. The kind of joke that starts with laughter and ends with a knot in your stomach. The kind that makes you wish you could rewind time and undo what's been done. It was a sunny afternoon in the small town of Willow Creek, where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a pace so slow it felt like the world had forgotten about them. The kind of place where nothing exciting ever happened. Until it did. And when it did, it changed everything. The group of guys, all in their early 20s, had been hanging out at the old park near the edge of town. They were the usual crew: Jake, the ringleader with a quick wit and a knack for trouble; Marcus, his loyal sidekick who never said no to a dare; and a few others who followed along because it was easier than thinking for themselves. They were bored, as usual, and boredom in Willow Creek often led to bad decisions. That's when they spotted her, Aisha, a young black woman who had recently moved to town. She was sitting on a bench, minding her own business, reading a book. To them, she was an outsider, someone they didn't know and didn't care to know. And that made her the perfect target. It started with whispers, then laughter, then a plan that spiraled out of control before anyone could stop it. They approached her, pretending to be friendly, but their intentions were anything but. Before she knew what was happening, they had tied her to a pole, a thick, rusted metal pole that stood in the middle of the park. They laughed as they did it, calling it a joke, a prank, something she should just lighten up about. But the look in Aisha's eyes wasn't fear or anger. It was something else, something they couldn't quite place. It was as if she knew something they didn't, something that made her silence more unsettling than any scream. As the guys stepped back to admire their handiwork, their laughter began to fade. The weight of what they had done started to sink in, but it was too late. A crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves, some horrified, others unsure of what to do. Aisha didn't say a word. She just stood there, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. And then, just as the tension in the air became unbearable, a car pulled up to the park. A sleek, black SUV with tinted windows. The doors opened, and out stepped a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that made everyone stop and stare. The man's eyes scanned the scene, taking in the sight of Aisha tied to the pole, the group of guys frozen in place, the crowd watching in silence. His expression darkened, and when he spoke, his voice was low but carried the weight of a storm about to break. "Who did this?" he demanded, his eyes locking onto Jake and his friends. No one answered. No one dared to. Because this man wasn't just anyone. He was the new chief of police, and as he walked over to Aisha and gently untied her, he said the words that sent a chill through everyone present. "This is my sister." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake and his friends exchanged panicked glances, their bravado crumbling under the weight of their mistake. The crowd began to disperse, whispering among themselves, but the tension in the air was far from gone. If anything, it had only just begun. Because this wasn't just about a prank gone wrong. This was about power, about consequences, about a small town where everyone thought they knew the rules, until someone new came along and changed the game. And as the new chief helped his sister to the car, his eyes never left the group of guys. There was a promise in that gaze, a promise that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But what happened next? How would the town react? And what would the new chief do to the men who had humiliated his sister? The answers to those questions would unravel in ways no one could have predicted, setting off a chain of events that would leave Willow Creek forever changed. Because sometimes a joke isn't just a joke. Sometimes it's the spark that lights a fire, and this fire was only just beginning to burn. The new chief's name was Elijah Carter, and he wasn't just any cop. He had a reputation that preceded him, even in a town as small and insular as Willow Creek. Before coming here, he'd worked in the city, where he'd made a name for himself as a no-nonsense officer who didn't back down from a fight, whether it was against criminals or the corruption within his own department. He was the kind of man who believed in justice, not just the law, and he had the scars to prove it. But this was personal. And in a town where everyone knew everyone, Personal meant dangerous. Aisha, his younger sister, had always been the quiet one in the family. While Elijah was out making headlines, she was the one who stayed in the background, studying, working, and building a life of her own. She had moved to Willow Creek to escape the chaos of the city, to find a place where she could breathe and start over. But now, as she sat in the passenger seat of Elijah's SUV, her hands still trembling from the ordeal, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. The town she thought would be her sanctuary had turned into a nightmare in just a few short weeks. And the worst part? She didn't even know why. Why had they targeted her? Was it because she was new? Because she was different? Or was it something deeper, something uglier, that she hadn't wanted to see? Elijah didn't say much as he drove. His jaw was clenched, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was furious, but not just at the guys who had tied his sister to that pole. He was furious at himself. He had taken this job to protect people, to make a difference. And yet, here he was, barely a month into his new role, and his own sister had been humiliated in broad daylight. What kind of chief was he if he couldn't even keep his family safe? The question gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Right now, he needed to focus on Aisha. She was his priority. Everything else could wait. When they got home, Elijah made tea, a habit he'd picked up from their mother, who always said there was nothing a cup of tea couldn't fix. Aisha sat at the kitchen table, her book still clutched in her hands, though she hadn't turned a single page. She stared out the window, her mind racing. She wanted to be angry, to scream, to demand justice. But all she felt was tired. Tired of being the outsider. Tired of being the target. Tired of feeling like she didn't belong anywhere. "Talk to me," Elijah said, setting the tea in front of her. His voice was softer now, but there was still an edge to it. He needed to know what had happened, every detail, no matter how small. Aisha sighed and finally put the book down. She told him everything. How she'd been sitting in the park, how the guys had approached her, how they'd laughed as they tied her to the pole. She didn't leave anything out, not even the way their laughter had echoed in her ears, making her feel small and powerless. Elijah listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with every word. When she finished, he leaned back. In his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't just a prank. It was a message, a warning, and he needed to figure out who had sent it and why. Meanwhile, back at the park, Jake and his friends were trying to figure out what to do. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of their stomachs. They had messed up, big time, and now they were facing the consequences. Jake, usually the one with all the answers, was at a loss. He kept replaying the scene in his head, the way the new chief had looked at them, the way Aisha had just stood there, silent and unyielding. It didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like a mistake. A huge, irreversible mistake. "What are we gonna do?" Marcus asked, his voice shaky. He was the youngest of the group, the one who always followed Jake's lead. But now, he was scared. They all were. Jake didn't answer right away. He was too busy thinking, trying to come up with a plan. But the truth was, there was no plan. There was no way to undo what they had done. All they could do was wait and see what happened next as the sun began to set. Casting long shadows over the park, the town of Willow Creek buzzed with whispers. Everyone had heard about what had happened, and everyone had an opinion. Some were outraged, calling for the guys to be punished. Others were more cautious, warning against jumping to conclusions. After all, it was just a joke, right? But deep down, everyone knew it was more than that. This wasn't just about Aisha or the new chief. This was about the town itself, about the way things had always been and the way they were starting to change. Elijah knew this too. As he sat in his office the next morning, going over the incident report, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Willow Creek was a town with secrets, secrets that had been buried for years. And now, those secrets were starting to surface. He didn't know what he was dealing with yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt his sister again. Not without a fight. But the question remained. Who was behind this? Was it just a group of stupid kids? Or was there something bigger at play? And how far were they willing to go to protect their secrets? Elijah didn't have the answers yet, but he was determined to find them. No matter what it took. As for Aisha, she was done being the victim. She had spent her life staying quiet, staying out of the way. But now, she realized, silence wasn't an option. Not anymore. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let them win. Whatever they were planning, whatever game they were playing, she was going to fight back. And she wasn't going to do it alone. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. And as the sun rose over Willow Creek, casting its golden light over the quiet streets, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The question was, who would come out on top? And at what cost? The answers were still hidden, buried beneath layers of lies and half-truths. But one thing was certain. The storm was coming. And when it hit, no one would be safe.